And thank you for your kind welcome, Peter, and also for having us in this series. To say a little bit more about the two of us, we are members of Miriam Fried's research group EPOCH in Prague, which quite presets our theoretical perspective on multimodality to the construction grammar approach. Okay, in today's talk, after providing you with a few potential characteristics of our approach, we will present two studies on gesture marking of event structure. The first one, a corpus-based study, will investigate multimodal patterns of event structure in English and Czech. And the second study will be a follow-up experimental study focusing on Czech only. The gestural representation of event structure has been in focus since the advent of modern linguistic studies of co-speech gestures, grounded in the theoretical framework of cognitive linguistics. Among these, the broadest cross-linguistic evidence so far has been brought by the most recent work by Czech and his colleagues in 2018. The most salient findings in the literature with respect to our research are the following. First, bounded gestures mark bounded events, where bounded events refer either to perfective aspect forms or telic or punctual predicates. On the contrary, unbounded gestures and complex gestures, for instance, repeated strokes, accompany either imperfective aspectual forms or atelic and protracted events that takes place over some time span, or the progressive forms. In complex forms, the inner structure of gesture phrase can be mapped on the internal structure of an event. For instance, a number of substrokes can correspond to the number of event subphases as attested in Hinnell 2018. To deal with event semantics in this study, we have adopted Croft's cognitive model of aspectual types. Croft proposed a two-dimensional phasal model which delimits the temporal and qualitative properties of event aspectual construals. The model stems from general cognitive operations that affect linguistic construals, among which attention and profiling are the most prominent ones. Hence, some phases of particular construals are profiled, while others remain unprofiled. They are either presupposed or implied by the event. As regards particular aspectual types, Croft draws on Wendler's well-known categorization of events into states, processes, telic durative accomplishments, and semi-effective or punctual achievements. But he also enriches the classification with other features relevant for the delimitation of aspectual subtypes. The first one that we want to mention and incorporate in our model is directedness, according to which directed events contain a natural endpoint towards which the event is directed, and they can be either telic, when the phase of reaching an endpoint is profiled in the aspectual contour, or atelic, when it is not. In some directed events, the event proceeds towards the endpoint incrementally, which means that a subphase of an event corresponds to a subpart of the patient, therefore the entity affected by the event. So there is a corresponding mapping between a sub-event and subpart of entity present in incremental events. And so it seems reasonable to distinguish between incremental and non-incremental events in the model. Particular aspectual types and their contours can be visualized in a two-dimensional representation, as you can see for two utterances on this slide. The first one, yesterday she was editing the video from 3 to 5 p.m. It depicts a directed incremental activity that is temporally bounded. It took place for 2 hours, but it remains qualitatively unbounded because the endpoint has not been reached and thus remains unprofiled in the contour. On the contrary, in the second example, he baked a cake for his family yesterday. This is a directed accomplishment that is both temporally and qualitatively bounded, as the endpoint was reached and thus it is profiled in the schema. To turn the model of aspectual types into a multimodal one, we adopted a constructional account of multimodality, which is often referred to as multimodal construction grammar. The core properties of our approach are the following. Given the fact that aspectual distinctions can be encoded via different formal means, as suggested by Martin Haspelmath and other functional typologists quite a long time ago now, we adopt an anonymasiological approach to the phenomena studied here. This anonymasiological approach is quite common in constructional approaches, and this allows us to focus on how common conceptual properties of events are construed across languages, and thus we can trace down the language-specific properties. As manifested in Kraft's model, aspectual contours are typically complex and multidimensional, varying in terms of outer delimitation as well as inner structure of events, as we could see when I presented his model. Therefore, we follow the same approach to gestural marking of event structure. Unlike most of previous studies, we propose a compositional approach to boundedness, distinguishing between outer and inner boundedness, which I explain in a moment. The outer and inner boundedness are complementary features in our model. Outer boundedness is signaled by a marked ending or a halt in the gestural movement, and it's quite akin to sign language phonology as presented, for instance, in Wilbur in 2003. And it's also similar to phonologically based guidelines for gesture classification in Bresson. And it's different to the kinesiological approach proposed by Dominique Boutet. We find the latter hard to operationalize in human annotation, which is not supported by tools for automatic detection. So that's why we prefer the phonological approach to boundedness in our studies. We distinguish between ended and continuous gestures as for the outer boundedness distinction. Through the inner boundedness or internal structure of gestural phrase, we specify whether the phrase is simple or complex. Let's have a look at two examples supporting the idea of complex gesture contours aligning with the event structure. In the first example on this slide, the Czech speaker expresses verbally that they sort of anticipate their reaction. The anticipation refers to a mental activity, and the speaker expresses a complex gestural phrase of the type CE, which is continuous on the inner structure and ended at the end in terms of outer boundedness. So there's a continuous internal movement with closed with an abrupt ending, and we marked up this type CE. On the following slide, in this example, we observe a simple gesture phrase with an ended gesture accompanying the VP verbal phrase, nobody comes to a certain location, which is a directed achievement on its own. Building on what has been said so far, for our corpus study, we expected that there would be a tendency for the gesture forms to co-occur with certain event types in English and Czech. We conducted an exploratory corpus-based study, yet some predictions could be postulated based on the aggregated evidence from the previous studies. We expected achievements and accomplishment to attract ended gestures, as well as we expected the same basically for directed aspectual types as well. On the contrary, we expected that incremental aspectual types will attract complex gestures because their inner structure is rather complex, as I explained before. For English progressive, we expected it to be associated with continuous or complex gestures or both. And in Czech, we expected that outer gestural boundedness will mirror the grammatical aspectual distinction of perfective and imperfective aspects because it's grammatical. As data for our study, we used similarly constructed samples from English and Czech multimodal corpora. The samples consisted of 4 sessions of business meetings of 3 hours per language, involving 18 speakers in total. In total, we got 575 multimodal constructs, out of which a little bit more than 300 were in English, and 443 came from the Czech subcorpus. And it's important to mention that both samples were relatively similar in type token ratio. The data were annotated in ELAN. Apart from aspectual features following from the simplified Crofts model, we coded other potentially relevant features, for instance, sentence negation, number countability and definiteness of the complement, and modifier boundedness. The enter-annotator agreement using Cohen's kappa scored 0.55 for the annotation of aspectual types, which corresponds to moderate agreement, and 0.79 for the annotation of gesture types, which corresponds to a substantial agreement. As for the results, in both languages, ended simplex was the most frequent gesture type. However, this effect may be caused not only by the factors based on aspectuality, but on other factors, among which the most probable one is the information structure, because the verbal phrases that were accompanied by gestures were usually placed in the focal part of the utterance. The continuous types occurred more frequently in the complex form. So there was a correlation between continuous and complex types. The ended gestures had a significantly stronger association with achievements in English, whereas in Czech, the observed frequency of continuous gestures was significantly greater than expected. Importantly, there was no significant difference in the distribution of gesture types and aspectual types alone in the two languages. The relationship between the variables was explored by means of the conditional inference trees and random forests that you can see. You can see the outcome of the model here on this slide. And this is method primarily used by corpus linguists and not yet applied in the multimodal context. We chose this method because it provides a suitable alternative to regression models that have limitations when the dataset is small and the variables are intercorrelated, which is the case of our data, and it's often the case with multimodal corpora in general. We ran the analysis separately for auto-boundedness and complexity and for the two languages. So here comes the summary of the corpus-based study. We confirmed that the main findings of the distribution of gestural boundedness, previously supported by mainly experimental data and narrative tasks, are also observable in spontaneous interactional data. Apart from that, our data reveal more complex and language-specific multimodal constructional patterns. In English, ended gestures were predicted by Vandal classes, delimiting achievements on one side and the rest of the system on the other. It seems that the achievements in English, often construed as punctual or relatively momentaneous, such as in the verb happen, attract the ended gestures the most out of all aspectual types. Complex forms were associated with incrementality and progressive predicates, plus there was a strong correlation of complex gestures with continuous types of gestures. In Czech, ended gestures were associated with perfective aspect and directed imperfective forms, whereas continuous gestures were associated with undirected imperfectives, which means with atylic processes and states, which means that perfectivity and directedness both play a role in the prediction of the distribution of gestures in Czech interactions. Gesture complexity was also associated with more fine-grained features than aspect, namely those of directedness as well as incrementality. And that's all for the first part, and now I will pass the word to Jakub.
Okay, the experiment was conducted as a follow-up to the corpus study to investigate the comprehension of multimodal expressions of eventuality in the speakers of Czech only this time. The experiment was based on the common playback paradigm, which is a method in which participants are presented with video clips of gesture production, often together with linguistic stimuli, creating gesture-speech combinations that are semantically congruent or incongruent. And so was the case in our study, which was also based on the forced choice paradigm. The participants saw videos with either ended or continuous gestures that were followed by pairs of sentences that differed only in aspect, and in some cases in directedness as well. The experiment was designed in PsychoPy, and it was administered online at the Pavlovia, which is a free platform for running behavioral studies, a greatly valuable project, especially in times like these. So a huge thanks to people who run this thing. The linguistic part of the stimuli was created carefully, taking several steps, starting with selecting the sample of suitable verbs. Firstly, we wanted to eliminate the verbs that, with a high gestural affordance. Now, what is gestural affordance? For instance, the verb cut can very well be accompanied by an ended-like gesture, regardless of aspectuality. So we wanted to avoid confusion between directly iconic and metaphoric aspectual mapping. 100 most frequent transitive verbs were sampled from the reference corpus of Czech, and they were rated by 12 native speakers for the degree to which the verbs invoke a vivid sensory impression, visual, auditory, olfactory, or motoric. That definition corresponds to imageability, and imageability was used as a proxy for gestural affordance in this study. 24 verbs with the lowest scores, which were verbs of mental action or communication, were selected for the construction of sentence pairs that all followed the final word order to ensure that the gestures will be associated with the verbs and not else. The nature of the Czech aspectual system, as was mentioned before, allowed for constructing what were nearly minimal aspectual pairs, as most verbs come in morphologically marked aspectual variants. Only 3 verbs in our sample, however, allowed for constructing sentence pairs that would differ in directedness too. So most of the stimulus sentence pairs only differed in aspect and were directed. The gesture part of the stimuli involved ended and continuous gestures produced by a gesturer, who happens to be me, executing a set of gestures defined by phonological features of hand orientation, position, movement, and hand shape. The 2 critical conditions differed only in the parameter of accentuated ending. As the distractors, enactment gestures were produced that corresponded to the verbs with the highest gestural affordance scores, and they were verbs of human action or manipulation. To control the movement parameters, motion capture was employed. The mocap recordings were carried out by the courtesy of the mocap lab at the University in Aachen, using 6 sensors, with a special focus on the right hand index finger marker, as the gestures were performed by the right hand. The diagram on the right hand side shows the horizontal position of the index finger marker during the stroke phase of a continuous gesture and an ended gesture. And we can clearly see the steep slope of deceleration of the ended blue gesture compared to a relatively gentle slope of the red line, which is the continuous gesture. 40 subjects took part in the study. All were native Czech speakers, recruited via a network or a snowball, if you like, of contacts. Importantly, they all weren't undergrad students, as is usual, but they came from a variety of backgrounds. The procedure was simple. The subjects saw a video, followed by a screen with 2 sentences, and the subjects were asked to choose which sentence fits the video better. In the ended gesture condition, 80% of responses were perfective, In the continuous gesture condition, the majority of responses were imperfective, but there still was almost 40% of perfective choices. The logistic regression model revealed that the only significant predictor of aspectual choice was the type of gesture. The other factors included to the model being directedness of the imperfective variant, deixis, and number of the object. And all factors were included in interaction with the gesture type. Yeah. Sorry. This one. Yeah. Sorry. The perfective responses in the ended condition were also the fastest in terms of reaction latencies, while the incongruent choices had higher reaction times. A mixed effect linear regression with the same predictors as the logistic one, plus the relative frequency ratio of the aspectual variants. I can get back to that in discussions if you like. Again, showed that the only significant predictor is the gesture type in interaction with the response type. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So there is clearly a tendency to associate ended gestures with perfective aspect, but it gets more complicated when we acknowledge that e-gestures, as has been mentioned at the beginning, are very frequent and multifunctional. For example, they were reported to mark sentence focus, and in our study, the verbs in the stimulus sentences are in the final position. So it's typically, or prototypically, it is also a position of focus marking. So the ended type could be associated with emphasis rather than aspectual types in these cases. Also, in the final position, perfective variants of the verbs may sound more natural than imperfectives. So the results may also reflect this. They may reflect this acceptability at the purely linguistic level and not at the multimodal level. Directedness was a significant predictor, but only in the fixed effects only model. So which proved to be less accurate than the mixed effect model. So the lack of significance is a result of a small sample of sentences with different directedness, quite clearly. Also, undirected imperfective sentences were the ones that have the strongest association with the continuous types. So it's one of the challenges for the future research to look more closely at directedness. To conclude, the corpus-based and experimental evidence converge toward a general observation that both ended simplex and continuous complex forms of gestures can be associated with aspectual types in English and Czech, but there are some language-specific tendencies. First, there is overt morphological marking of aspect in Czech, which may be linked to a greater role of gesture in the control of finer-grained lexical semantic features, such as directedness and incrementality. Second, both in English and Czech, specific clusters of gesture forms appear to be associated with different lexicalization patterns at the morphological level. This is the case of English progressive constructions and Czech perfective. The first is a visible manifestation of profiling operations. The second is a sign of an ongoing multimodal constructionalization. We observed that gestures' role in control operations varies, and we could identify two general modes of profiling. First is called profiling for highlighting, in which gesture foreground the target part of the semantic frame. The second kind of profiling is the so-called profiling for discrimination, in which gesture provides the critical input for the interpretation of construal alternatives. So following this direction, the future steps should be heading towards bringing more evidence of conventionalizing aspectual patterns in the languages in question, such as incremental events in combination with continuous and complex gestures in Czech and English, directed perfective and imperfective types in Czech, or contrastive patterns of achievement and accomplishment multimodal predicates in English. And that's all from us at this point. Thank you.